This is not a story that began yesterday. It did not begin with the first missile strike, or with breaking headlines, or with a single act of aggression. It began decades ago, in a moment that reshaped an entire region and set the stage for a conflict that has lasted generations. To understand why Iran and the United States have reached this dangerous breaking point, we must travel back to 1953, a year that would mark the first turning point in a rivalry that has defined the modern Middle East. In that year, a US and British-backed coup removed Iran's elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh was targeted after he nationalized the country's oil industry, challenging Western control. What seemed, at the time, like a political maneuver to secure influence would instead leave a wound in Iran's national memory, one that would never fully heal or be forgotten by its people. This all began in the early Cold War era, when Iran sat at the center of global competition between superpowers. The United States and the United Kingdom saw Mossadegh's nationalization of oil as a strategic threat to their economic interests and global energy stability. The restoration of the Shah made Iran a strong Western partner for years afterward, serving as a pillar of US policy in the region. But the deeper consequence was psychological and historical. Resentment did not vanish when the coup ended. It merely went underground. It settled into the national memory of Iran, where it would later return with full force during future upheavals. What looked like a short-term victory for Washington became a long-term source of anger in Tehran, fueling the fire of anti-imperialist sentiment for decades. Then came 1979 and everything changed again. After years of growing unrest and domestic dissatisfaction with the Shah's rule, the Iranian Revolution overthrew the monarchy. This seismic shift brought Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini to power, and Iran's identity shifted dramatically and permanently. The new government rejected the old relationship with Washington, denounced American influence as the Great Satan, and placed itself on a revolutionary path. This path was openly hostile to US interests, seeking to export its revolutionary ideals across the borders of the Middle East. That same year, the seizure of the US embassy in Tehran turned political hostility into a deep national trauma for Americans. It made the conflict far more personal, far more emotional, and far harder to reverse, as images of the crisis dominated global news cycles. 66 Americans were taken hostage, and 52 remained captive for a staggering 444 days. From that moment onward, the relationship entered a new and darker phase. It was no longer a normal diplomatic dispute that could be solved through traditional table talks. It became a long confrontation built on sanctions, suspicion, retaliation, and hidden pressure. The United States froze Iranian assets, cut all diplomatic ties, and gradually built a policy of international isolation designed to weaken the new revolutionary regime's grip on power. Iran, in turn, built a political identity centered around resistance to American power. Over time, each side came to see the other not as a temporary opponent, but as a permanent strategic enemy whose very existence posed a threat to their own national security. And that is why this conflict never stayed frozen in time. It kept evolving, spreading, and changing shape as the decades passed. Sometimes it manifested as intense economic pressure. Sometimes it was carried out through covert actions and intelligence operations deep in the shadows. Sometimes it was military confrontation in the background rather than on the front page of every newspaper. Even when no official war had been declared, the hostility was still very much alive. The two nations were no longer simply arguing over policy or borders. They were locked into a visceral struggle over power, survival, influence, and legacy. Then the nuclear question raised the stakes to an existential level. By the 2000s, Iran's nuclear program had become one of the biggest and most complex flashpoints in the world. The United States and its allies feared Iran could be moving toward a nuclear weapon, which would shift the balance of power. Iran insisted that its program was entirely peaceful and intended for energy. Negotiations eventually led to the 2015 nuclear deal, JCPOA. For a time, this agreement offered a potential path away from total confrontation, but that diplomatic opening did not last. When the US withdrew from the agreement in 2018 and maximum pressure, sanctions returned, The rivalry hardened and the window of trust slammed shut. The chance for a stable diplomatic reset slipped away, and both sides moved back toward a posture of pressure and defiance. After that, the battlefield expanded far beyond Iran's physical borders. The conflict moved across the region through alliances, proxies, and regional power struggles. Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, and the wider Gulf all became spaces where Iranian influence and American interests collided indirectly. This was one of the most important features of the modern conflict. It functioned as a shadow war through various regional players and armed groups. Airstrikes, sanctions, and mutual deterrence became the daily reality of this struggle. Over time, the Middle East became the theater where this rivalry played out again and again in a cycle of violence. And now, that long, simmering history has finally erupted into open conflict. US-led strikes began hitting Iran, targeting military and strategic infrastructure across the country. These were followed by waves of retaliation that spread across the region like wildfire. The fighting escalated rapidly, drawing in multiple fronts and raising global fears of a wider war. What had once been contained through indirect confrontation was now unfolding in full view of the world. The economic consequences were immediate and severe. Oil prices surged as uncertainty spread across global markets, affecting everything from gas prices to the cost of shipping. Shipping routes in the region became vulnerable, and the stability of the global energy supply was suddenly in grave question. This war is not only about armies and governments, it is about trade, energy, and the survival of the global economy in an interconnected world. When key routes like the Strait of Hormuz are threatened, the impact is felt worldwide, from industrial hubs to kitchen tables. What makes this moment even more dangerous is that no one can honestly say the crisis came out of nowhere. It was entirely predictable. This was not a sudden collapse of relations. It was a slow, agonizing buildup of historical memory and political humiliation. Strategic mistrust, military pressure, and repeated failed attempts to create lasting peace all contributed to the final breaking point we see today. The same patterns have appeared again and again. The coup of '53, the revolution of '79, the hostage crisis, and decades of sanctions. Each event added a layer of complexity and anger that made a peaceful resolution more difficult for leaders on both sides to achieve. The present conflict is not an isolated event. It is the latest chapter in a story that began generations ago. This war is the culmination of decades of mistrust, miscalculation, and unresolved tension between two nations that have forgotten how to speak to one another. Each side firmly believes it is defending itself against an aggressor. Each believes it is merely responding to the provocations of the other. And yet, the cycle of action and reaction has hardened over time, leaving almost no room for compromise or diplomatic maneuver. What started in 1953 became a revolution in 1979, then a hostage crisis, then sanctions, then nuclear tension, then regional conflict. Now it has finally reached the stage of open war. History does not vanish. It waits quietly in the background, shaping events. It shapes them in ways that often only become clear decades after the original actors have left the stage. And when history finally catches up to the present, it arrives with full force and devastating clarity. This is that moment of historical reckoning for the world. The past has collided with the present in a violent explosion of unresolved grievances. The world is watching as a 70-year conflict finally erupts, threatening to redraw the map of the Middle East once again. This war is the result of a refusal to address the root causes. As missiles fly and sanctions tighten, the voices of the past echo through the halls of power. The ghost of 1953 still haunts the decision-makers in Tehran, while the trauma of 1979 still dictates the political boundaries in Washington, D.C. and beyond. The economic infrastructure of the 21st century is now at the mercy of a 20th century rivalry. Trade routes that carry the lifeblood of global commerce are being patrolled by warships, and the threat of a total shutdown of energy exports looms over every international summit. Military strategists are now forced to navigate a landscape where every strike could trigger a regional domino effect. Alliances that were built for deterrence are now being tested in the crucible of active combat, forcing nations to choose sides in a binary conflict. The humanitarian impact is growing as the conflict touches civilian lives across several borders. Displacement, loss of infrastructure, and the psychological toll of constant escalation are the true costs of this 70-year rivalry finally reaching its boiling point in the modern era. International organizations are struggling to find a foothold for mediation in a climate of absolute defiance. The mechanisms of global governance designed to prevent such a widespread eruption are being bypassed by the raw power of national interest and historical anger. As the smoke rises, historians will point to this moment as the inevitable end of a path chosen decades ago. They will look at the missed opportunities for peace, the failed treaties, and the ignored warnings that paved the way for this current state of total war. The narrative of us versus them has become so deeply entrenched that alternative futures are now hard to imagine. The language of diplomacy has been replaced by the language of kinetic force, as both sides seek a definitive victory that history suggests may be elusive. The world remains in a state of high alert, waiting to see if this eruption can be contained or if it will consume the entire region. The stakes have never been higher, and the lessons of the past have never felt more relevant or more ignored by those in power. History has arrived. The story that began with a coup and a struggle over oil has reached its most violent chapter yet. Africa was the beginning of the human story, but this conflict represents a modern struggle that could redefine the future for us all.